Danny and I recently started watching the show Cobra Kai on Netflix. And if you're not familiar with that show, it is a show that brings us back into the lives of Danny LaRusso and Johnny Lawrence of Karate Kid fame, if you remember that movie. And if you saw that movie, you might remember this story of this battle between these two young men. Danny comes into town moving from New Jersey with his mother, and he is the new kid, and he is bullied and harassed and beaten up by Johnny and his karate crew, where they were taught at their local dojo that they should show no mercy, and they don't to Daniel. And Daniel is taken under the wing of Mr. Miyagi, who teaches him karate, teaches him to defend himself, teaches him this way of balance. And so, in this stunning twist of events at the end of the movie, and like the climax of the movie, Daniel beats Johnny. You remember that kick? I have a skirt on, so. He defeats Johnny in this just surprise, hooray for the underdog kind of a way in the Valley Championship that year. And now this TV show catches us back up with them, like 35 plus years later, as adult grown men. And Daniel, we see, has taken that victory and turned it into this life of success. He has a car dealership with many locations, a beautiful wife, a huge house, 2 kids. And Johnny, in that moment of defeat, just kind of, his life just goes kind of down from there. He is down on his luck. He's in this kind of dead-end job that he gets fired from. He has a teenage son who he's estranged from, or maybe that's not the right word, because he never really had a relationship with him to begin with, and the son is troubled. And you would think, really, that 35 years later, they both would have moved on from all of these events, that this would not be the defining moment of their lives. And yet, we see flashbacks over the course of the episodes of these 2 men. Johnny, who is angry and depressed at the fame and glory he thought would be his, and the success that he thought would come to him, and now his life has gone very much the other direction. And Daniel, even with all of his success, is still haunted by the fear and the trauma that came from him being bullied and beat up and harassed so many years before. And it all comes back when they have this chance encounter when Johnny's car is towed to Daniel's car dealership for repair. And they just happen to run into each other, and now when we met these characters way back in 1984, the characters were about 17, 18 years old, the same age Joseph is in this Genesis story when it starts. Joseph, the story tells us, is Jacob's favorite son. He is the firstborn of Jacob and Rachel, his favorite wife. Remember, he has the 2 sisters that are wives, and then their 2 handmaids are given to him to give birth to more children, because there's this like childbearing competition between the 2 sisters. And Rachel and Jacob have Joseph, who is their oldest, but the 11th of the 12 sons. So he's like very much the younger brother. And yet here he is, 17 years. You know what I mean? 17-year-old boys. That prefrontal cortex doesn't really get developed until they're like 25. And he's a little bit cocky. You know, his dad's favorite, strutting around in the long robe with the sleeves, which was a big deal to get this gift. It wasn't like you could go to the clothing store and buy stuff. This had to be made custom for him, and it would have been a big deal. And the brothers didn't get any robe, just Joseph. And then, they already can't stand him. And then he has this dream, and that prefrontal cortex, the one that like kind of governs your impulse control, is not kicking in yet for him. And so he has this dream, and what does he do? He goes and he tells the brothers about the dream. Y'all are gonna, be my servants someday. Trying to prove himself, Everybody's trying to climb up the pecking order. And this is not new with this family, right? Like, the family conflict goes back to Abe and his 2 sons, Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac, and their moms, who who are conflicted. Jacob and his twin brother Esau. You remember Jacob had to run for his life when he stole their dad's blessing from Esau. And now these 12 sons competing for status with dear old dad. And Jacob sends Joseph out one day to find his brothers, and they see him coming and they plot to kill him, and Reuben intervenes and they throw Joseph into a pit instead. And I have never really, until this week, kind of envisioned that scene. We kind of like skip over it. Oh, he's in a pit. The slave traders come, they take him off. But I'm imagining him in this pit where he can't see what is happening, but he can hear his brothers. And they're sitting down to have a picnic. And I was imagining this 17-year-old boy saying, all right, guys, come on, it's not funny, get me out. You know, at first. And then like the panic and the anxiety that rises as he stays in the pit and they ignore him and they just have their food there, and then he hears the traders with their camels coming close by, and he hears his brothers negotiating for this 20 pieces of silver, and just the terror that comes when he realizes they're really going to do this. This isn't funny anymore. They're going to sell him into slavery. Just that panic and just trauma of the fact that his brothers would sell him into slavery in a foreign land. And the Bible doesn't tell us much about what goes through his mind, though there is a verse stuck in the intervening chapters about the brothers talking about, we heard Joseph's anguish when we did this to him, and now that anguish is coming back on us. So we know he didn't just like kind of take it and not, mind. Like, he wanted to stay home. And what do you do when your family betrays you this way? When they allow that jealousy and hatred and fear to consume them and push them into selling him into slavery, what do you do with that? And we just kind of gloss over all of that trauma and all of these decades of him living in Egypt, because we know what happens at the end is that he lands on his feet. I mean, more than lands on his feet. If you were to read the intervening chapters, you would see the narrator tells us over and over again, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph when he was in slavery in Potiphar's house and he rises to be like the chief steward. The Lord was with Joseph when he gets thrown into prison because he is accused of attempted rape, and he languishes there for a few years. And then the Lord is with him again when he rises to power under Pharaoh as the interpreter of dreams. Remember, Pharaoh has those two dreams of the fat cows and the skinny cows. And Joseph is able to tell him what that means. And Pharaoh puts him in charge of the food and famine program so that he is in charge of storing up the grain and distributing it. That's how the brothers end up coming down to Egypt. And so that's all well and good, but what do you do in those in-between years? How do you think that affects a 17-year-old? And what did it do to his brothers, who not only sold him into slavery, but conspired with each other to cover it up, who lied to their dad for decades about what really happened that day when they found the robe? There's that movie, I don't think I ever saw it, but the I Know What You Did Last Summer, and the guilt and the regret and the fear of being found out, and that eats away at you, and you can imagine that with the brothers as well. What do we do with situations like this where we have been wronged, where we have been hurt or betrayed? When our relationships break or fall apart, whether that is because of someone's intentional choice or just because of accrued misunderstandings and misconnection and insensitivity. What do we do when, like Joseph or like Daniel and Johnny, life wounds us deeply, and when it goes in directions we couldn't have predicted? That pain and that trauma carries with us. Even if on the surface, like with Daniel, it looks like everything's fine and he's having great success, and yet he still carries that pain of the past. I had a colleague this week in my tech study group who told us of the time in her life where she and her husband fostered a teenage boy whose story was very much like Joseph's. This was like probably 15 years ago. This young man was sold into slavery from Africa to a man in Michigan. His distant cousin came to the boy's father and said, "I will make sure Kwame gets a good education in America." And then he sold Kwame into slavery here in America, where he was forced to work for the man in whose house he lived, but along with a handful of other kids, and was abused mentally and physically. And we don't always, when we talk about human trafficking, we don't always think about that. We think about prostitution and that type of thing. But this type of human labor trafficking happens far too much in our country and in our world. And in Kwame's case, it was years, not as long as with Joseph, but years before he could get someone to understand what was happening to him and get him out. Years before he was rescued. What do you do with that? How do you make sense of these situations and move on and put the pieces back together, if you do? Most of us don't face anything nearly as dramatic as this, thank God. But we do often come face to face with difficult choices about what to do with the person or the situation that hurt us. Do we choose revenge or reconciliation? I'm still waiting to see what happens in Cobra Kai. We're only like 4 or 5 episodes in. I want to see if Johnny and Daniel can somehow make amends. Not that they're going to be buddies. There's too much history there. But if they can move past these hurts and struggles, if they can heal, if there is the possibility to stop holding grudges and stop having that one life event affect their whole lives, if they can find the balance that Mr. Miyagi taught Daniel about. My pastor friend told us that Kwame's faith was what got him through that horrible situation. That knowing that God was somehow with him, even in the terror of that event. And he saw God at work in the lives of all of the people who got him out. The people who rescued him, the foster parents who took him in, the adoptive family that gave him a permanent home, the social workers who intervened, the state legislators who heard about this case and worked to change the human trafficking laws and protections in Michigan. Kwame could see that even though this terrible thing happened to him, God was able to bring good out of it, not just for him, but for the wider world. And Joseph, too, saw that play out in his life. He saw God at work behind the scenes. He says to his brothers here at the end, when their father has died and they're afraid that Joseph's now going to come get his revenge, that he's just biding his time until Dad died. He says, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it to do good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. This is not to say that what happened to Kwame was not evil or harmful, that what Joseph's brothers did to him wasn't evil or harmful, and that they had no responsibility in it. And it is also not to say that God planned these terrible events. When we say God has a plan, I get a little nervous, because God doesn't plan for someone to get cancer. God doesn't plan for someone to be in a horrible car accident. God didn't plan for Kwame to get sold into slavery. But God is able to take all of those horrible situations, all of those tragedies, and bring some good out of them. It's hard for us to see that sometimes, but God is able to transform those hard things of our lives into blessings. Not always right away, right? Joseph took decades. Kwame took 5 or 6 years. And God is able to work in the hearts and the minds and the lives of Joseph and his brothers to bring Joseph finally that wisdom and discernment and forgiveness. To transform his brothers who, they're still trying to play a little game because, Dad said you should forgive us. Dad didn't say that, but you kind of understand. And you see that they have kind of grown and changed over the decades that they were apart. God is at work in the story to bring reconciliation instead of revenge, because revenge is not going to lead them anywhere good. That is also not to say that if someone has wounded you, you have to suddenly be their buddy. You don't have to do that, but God can still work in our lives to heal us, to move us to forgive, not necessarily to forget, but to not be held captive by that anymore, but instead to be free to move into the new things that God has in store for us. And to know that just as God was with Joseph, that God is present with us in all of these things that we face in life, the good and the bad. May God give us the eyes to see and the hearts to feel God's presence at work even in those hard times. And may God help us to see the good and the blessing God is able to bring out of the bad, even when it is delayed.